Now it's time for a son of Chennai to talk about his life and work. Dr. Nirmala Lakshman, Director KSL, the Hindu Group of Publications, and the curator of this festival will introduce the Renaissance man, Dr. Abraham Verghese.
Yesterday, we had the privilege of hearing Dr. Abraham Verghese in conversation with Jim Crace and David Godwin, and today we look forward to hearing him speak. There are few who can combine with great expertise and great elegance the roles of doctor, teacher, and writer. While I have no doubt that Dr. Verghese's address will leave us spellbound, I'd like to highlight a few important things about him. Abraham Verghese, MD, is the Linda R. Meyer and Joan F. Lane Provostial Professor and Vice Chair for the Theory and Practice of Medicine in the Department of Internal Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. A graduate of Madras University, Dr. Verghese trained as a resident and chief resident in internal medicine at East Tennessee State University and as a fellow in infectious diseases in Boston University. He has served on the faculty at the East Tennessee State University, the University of Iowa, Texas Tech University, and the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, San Antonio, where he was the founding director of the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics. He is board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, and infectious diseases. He served on the board of directors of the American Board of Internal Medicine. He is a master of the American College of Physicians and was elected to the Association of American Physicians as well as the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. His work in medicine has focused on the patient-physician relationship and on the bedside diagnostic examination. In 1990-91, Dr. Verghese attended the Iowa Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, where he obtained a Master of Fine Arts degree. His first book, My Own Country, about AIDS in rural Tennessee, was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award for 1994 and was made into a movie. His second book, The Tennis Partner, was a New York Times notable book and a national bestseller. His third book, Cutting for Stone, was published by Knopf and was a New York Times Book Review bestseller for over 2 years and is being made into a movie. He's been the commencement speaker at many medical schools and has honorary degrees from Swarthmore College, Northern Illinois University, and SUNY Upstate Medical University. He's published extensively in the medical literature, and his writing has appeared in The New Yorker, Sports Illustrated, The Atlantic Monthly, Esquire, Granta, the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and in other publications. Dr. Verghese has said, and I quote from an article he wrote in the Washington Post a couple of years ago, that medicine is his first great love. Whether I write fiction or nonfiction, and even when it has nothing to do with medicine, it's still about medicine. After all, what is medicine but life plus? So I write about life. I plunge into the river every morning. Let the current take hold. His twin passions, the medicine he practices and the fiction he writes, therefore inform one another, and to both he brings a simple but strongly effective touch. He is convinced that doctors need to return to the old-fashioned values of personal interaction, of conversation, of diagnosis and comfort by using what he believes is the most important diagnostic tool, the human hand. His writing, too, projects itself with the simplicity and empathy and with extraordinary passion and depth into the lives of others, whether it is fiction or nonfiction. Who can forget the harrowing narratives of AIDS, of his AIDS practice in My Own Country, or the account of a powerful and poignant friendship in The Tennis Partner? His novel, Cutting for Stone, is both thrilling and absorbing, but never leaves the reader in doubt that at the heart of the story, indeed, its triumph through loss and tragedy is the simple triumph of love. In an interview, he said, "My ambition as a writer was to tell a great story, an old-fashioned truth-telling story. I wanted the reader to see how entering medicine was a passionate quest, a romantic pursuit, a spiritual calling, a privileged yet hazardous undertaking. We're also reminded of some larger eternal truths. Marion Stone, one of the main characters in his novel, says, "We come unbidden into this life, and if we are lucky, we find a purpose beyond starvation, misery, and early death, which, lest we forget, is the common lot." Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and privileged to introduce my friend, Dr. Abraham Verghese.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nirmala, for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be back in Madras, back in Chennai. What I have in mind is to talk briefly for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a dialogue, hear some questions from you. The place that I'd like to begin is with a quote that I first heard in medical school. And when I first heard it, I thought it was so clever. The quote was, "Geography is destiny." And when I heard it, I was told this in the context of the birth canal and its proximity to all the other organs nearby. And that was the context of geography is destiny. And I thought, wow, that's really clever. That's really why I came to medical school, to learn that kind of stuff. And imagine my surprise some years later to find out that that quote, which was attributed to Freud didn't say that. Napoleon said that. Napoleon said geography is destiny, and Napoleon was speaking about France's particular position in the globe and in the ocean and so on. But as I think about that phrase, it's been so operative in my life. The fact that I came to Madras at two different points in my life had so much to do with my destiny. And I'd like to begin this story with my parents. My parents are from Kerala. And they both are physics teachers. They trained in physics. And by a strange quirk of destiny, they were both hired separately to Ethiopia. And by changing their geography and going to Ethiopia, their destiny changed and mine changed too. I should tell you the story of how they got to Ethiopia. I was told that the Emperor Haile Selassie came to India on a state visit. And he was they took him to see the Taj Mahal, and they took him to see all the things that you take state leaders to go see. But he wanted to go see the churches of Kerala because he comes from an ancient Christian country and knew about the tradition of St. Thomas. And so they took him to Kerala, and he happened to be on his motorcade just as thousands of children were heading for school in the early morning. And he was so taken by the sight of all these children with their white shirts and khaki pants and blue skirts heading for school in this orderly fashion that he hired all 400 of the teachers that he was hiring for his new schools. He hired them from this one Syrian Christian community. And so my parents were hired separately, and they arrived in Ethiopia within 2 weeks of each other, and they eventually met and married. They're kind of mysterious as to how that happened. We always thought it had something to do with physics or perhaps chemistry. But because they changed their geography, their destiny changed, and because of that, I was born in Ethiopia, and I had most of my childhood and early adulthood in Ethiopia. I came to Chennai when I was 15 to do pre-university and 1 year of zoology at Madras Christian College. And then I went back to Ethiopia and joined medical school there, a new medical school started by the British Council. And I did that for 3.5 years, and then civil war broke out, and my life was entirely disrupted when this harsh military government took over. And one of the first things they did was close the university, send students back out to the countryside to serve the masses, because they were really fearful of having intellectuals in town. And expatriates like me were asked to leave. And so I changed my geography again. I went to America. My parents had left some years before that. They'd left Ethiopia because they saw the writing on the wall. And I went to America, and I worked as an orderly. I worked for 1.5 years, bedpans and urinals and changing sheets and all that. And I look back on that now as the most profound medical training I ever had, because I really got to see what happens to the patient in the 23 hours and 57 minutes that the doctors are not in the room. Very profound training that made a huge impression on me. And then I came back to Madras, was taken in, very fortunately, after a long process of application, taken in at Madras Medical College in my third year, in the third year of medical school, and finished my internship, made a lot of very good friends, and that's how geography changed my destiny. But I want to backtrack a little bit and tell you how, in a strange way, books are what brought me to medicine, and a little later on I'll make the thesis that medicine is what brought me to writing. So I want to try and show you how that progression happened. I have an older brother who Lakshman knows, his classmate from IIT. My older brother, when he was, I think, about 6 or 7, his genius was manifest. He was clearly a math prodigy. He had a great aptitude for mathematics and actually for everything in the syllabus. And I always think that middle-class Indian parents, even as far away as Ethiopia, somehow seem to retain a lot of their core values, which as a child you understand to mean that your choices in life are that you can be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure. These are your options. So even though we were so far away in Ethiopia, those values were transmitted very clearly to me. And I remember my brother, when he was 9 or 10, making the announcement to my parents that he was going to be an engineer. And I remember their joy was something to behold. Nothing I had ever said produced that kind of excitement from them. And I remember feeling a bit left out. And so very shortly thereafter, I announced to my parents that I was going to be a physician. And their reaction was exactly like yours, quite muted. They said nothing. At one level, it seemed not unimaginable because I had a great interest in blood, mostly my own. I was always getting into scrapes, and I had a great fascination with animals being prepared for the kitchen, or animals giving birth, or animals engaging in that strange congress that I didn't realize was related to birth. All that could now pass as a form of scholarship now that I'd announced my decision to go into medicine. And so they didn't say very much about it, and I didn't say much more about it. And imagine my surprise some years later, maybe 1 or 2 years later, when I received my real calling to medicine, and it came because of a book. It came because of a book. I wasn't a particularly good student. I didn't really have a great aptitude for any one thing in the curriculum, but I was a precocious reader. I loved to read. And I remember I discovered Lady Chatterley's Lover when I was 9 years old. It made a very strong impression on me. And I found Lolita when I was 10. And I picked up the book that was to change my life because the title held great promise. It was Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. And imagine my surprise when I picked up the book and found that the book had nothing to do with all the titillation I imagined would be inside those pages. Instead, the book was so much more than that. How many of you know of human bondage? Show of hands. Oh, that's wonderful. This is really a very literate audience. For those of you who don't, and for those of you for whom it's been some time, let me just briefly tell you about this book. It begins on page 1 with your being introduced to a young boy by the name of Philip, and he has a club foot. And on page 1, he's being brought to his mother's deathbed to say goodbye to her. The father's not in the picture, and she says something to him like, listen to your elders, be a good boy. And by the top of page 2, she dies. And I can't think of a more tragic start to a novel. You know, a child with a club foot who is then orphaned by the second page. And you almost wonder why anyone would keep reading with that kind of an opening. But something about the magic of Somerset Maugham, something about his simple sentence constructions, the way he just lays one thing after the other, and you keep reading. And you find that Philip, not surprisingly, has a very harsh childhood. He's bullied because of his clubfoot. His foster parents are very, very strict. And his only escape is that he likes to paint. He's an artist. And painting is a release for him. It's one thing that he can do well. And so when he comes of age, at the age of 18, he makes his brave escape against his foster parents' wishes. He makes his brave escape to Paris to become an artist. And he arrives in Paris and he finds a place on the left bank. And he's taking lessons with Monsieur Fournier in the Academy, a very well-known artist. And he feels like he's finally reached his manifest destiny. He's finally doing the thing that he was always supposed to do. And he's very happy. But as the months go on, he begins to wonder if this is the right thing, because he's running out of money. He's wondering if he has the right talent for this, and it's much harder than he realizes. And one day he finds himself standing outside his garret in the cold, and he's freezing. And he's freezing because he's just sold his jacket because he's running out of money. And he's out in the cold because he's avoiding the landlady who's looking for the rent. And as he's standing there, hungry, he sees his professor, his teacher, Monsieur Fournier, walk by. And on an impulse, he stops him and he says, Monsieur Fournier, would you please come up and take a look at my paintings and tell me if you think I have what it takes to go on? And Monsieur Fournier is at first, not sure that he wants to do this, but some impulse makes him decide to go up. He feels sorry for Philip, and he goes up and looks at all the paintings and takes a long look, and finally he asks Philip, well, how's your financial situation? And Philip very apologetically says that he's running out of money. And Monsieur Fournier says a very interesting thing, which I often quote to people who ask me for writing advice. I don't really get asked much for writing advice, but when I do get asked writing advice, I like what Monsieur Fournier has to say. He says to Philip, don't be apologetic about not having money. For an artist, money is like a sixth sense, and without it, the other five don't work very well. So when people ask me for writing advice, I always tell them, and I'm not being facetious, get a good day job, something you love, and then the writing can be something that you add on. It's not something that, I have writer friends for whom the next bill, the kids going to college, all depend on, churning out another book. And I've been very blessed to do something that I love greatly, so I've never had to worry about that sort of thing. But to come back to Monsieur Fournier, he looks at all the paintings, and he finally says to Philip the equivalent of, is there something else you can be doing? And poor Philip is heartbroken, because this is really what he set his mind on, is escaping to Paris to be an artist, and to find out that that's not to be is distressing. And yet, it's the very thing he wanted from Monsieur Fournier. He wanted the truth. And so, somewhat relieved, he goes back to London, where there's some money, an annuity left for him to pursue medicine. And so he begins to study medicine, and the first 2 years are sheer drudgery. But then there comes this moment when Philip gets onto the hospital wards for the first time. And Somerset Maugham describes the moment as follows. Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas, and he said to himself, this is something I can do. This is something I can possibly be good at. Philip saw humanity there in the rough, and he said to himself, this is something I can do. This is something I can possibly be good at. And I must tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that those words just rang out to me. Those words seem to sort of jump off the page and grab me. They seem to imply that not anyone could be a great mathematician or a great artist, but almost anyone with a curiosity about the human condition, with an empathy for their fellow human beings, and a willingness to work hard could be a good physician. That's what I took away from that message. And thank you. I really wanted to jump up and announce to my parents that I had received my calling to be a physician, but of course I couldn't, because they thought I already had, so I had to keep quiet about it. And I was also in the process learning something very profound about books, that books can bring about significant inner changes that are sort of a quiet contract between you and the book. And the book might not necessarily speak to anyone else in quite the same way, but in the way that it speaks to you. And from that moment, I saw medicine as this romantic and passionate pursuit, the equivalent of art, if you will. And I've never really lost that feeling. I think if I have any success as a teacher, it's being able to convey what I think of as the great privilege of our being allowed into people's lives at very, very vulnerable moments, and the great history and tradition that allows us to function in this fiduciary role with our patients. I never thought I was going to do anything other than be a physician. I never had any ambitions to write. But then I lived through a very extraordinary story that is what made me a writer. I had trained in internal medicine when I finished in Madras. I went back to America. I trained in general medicine and went on to specialize in infectious diseases. And I wound up arriving in Boston for my specialty training around the time we were beginning to see the first young men arriving with bizarre infections, things like pneumocystis pneumonia and cryptococcal meningitis. And this was the herald signs of the AIDS epidemic. And we had no idea why these young men who didn't have transplants or weren't on steroids or hadn't had chemotherapy should be blossoming with this unusual constellation of infections. And I remember the fear and excitement of that time, because we knew this was a brand new disease. It was fearful because we didn't quite know how it was transmitted. And I remember one morning waking up to pick up the Boston Globe and to read that the cause for this mysterious illness had been discovered by Gallo and Montagnier, or Montagnier and Gallo, depending on who you believe, and how exhilarated I felt, because I thought, well, it's over now. We'll have, a treatment within a few months. And indeed, we had a diagnostic test within a week. And when the diagnostic test began to be used widely on people suspected of having this infection, it became clear that for every one young man I was caring for in the hospital, there were perhaps 100 or 200 out there also carrying the infection. And everything we knew suggested that they also would have the same eventual downhill decline. So the magnitude of the epidemic became quite evident. But I was leaving Boston. I was finishing my training. I was moving to a small town in Tennessee, Johnson City, Tennessee, population 50,000. And all the experts, all the pundits predicted that for a town that size in 1985, I would see one HIV-infected patient every other year, because this was very much an urban disease. And certainly when I got to Tennessee, I didn't see any HIV, but in a few months, I saw my first patient. And then a couple of months later, I saw my second patient. And then it became a monthly event, and then it became a weekly event, and then a twice-a-week event. And in a very short time, I had accumulated almost 100 people with HIV, 100-fold more than anyone had predicted for that town. And the mystery of why this town should have so much AIDS infection was really not that big a mystery after all. It was evident to me early on. It was not because the town was a hotbed of sexual intrigue and duplicity, which it was, by the way, but that wasn't the explanation. Instead, it appeared that I had stumbled onto an elaborate paradigm of migration. And the paradigm goes like this. A young man grows up in a small town and leaves for all the same reasons that you and I leave small towns. Jobs, education, opportunity. But in their case, they were also leaving because they were gay and didn't want to live that lifestyle under the close scrutiny of their friends and relatives. And so, just like you and I did, they made their brave exodus to the big city, found themselves and pursued their education, their jobs. But in their case, they also were able to sort of pursue their sexuality and live it openly without any fear or repercussions. And eventually, at some point in the paradigm, the virus found them, sometimes decades after their arrival in the city. And typically, they were infected, their partners were infected, their partners had died, and now there was no one to care for them. And so they had to make the call to their parents to say, I have AIDS and I'm coming home. And there I was at the tail end of that migration, seeing many more patients with HIV than anyone predicted for that small town. And I still remember the moment when I could see that paradigm so clearly. I remember that I had a patient who I called Hobart in the book, and he exemplified the paradigm. He had grown up in that town. He had an older brother who was 2 years older than him. His father was a preacher. His mother was a homemaker. And one of his earliest memories is walking through the schoolyard with his brother, who was 9 and he was 7. And his brother turned to him and said, "Must you walk that way?" And he was not aware that the way he walked was in any way different than the way the rest of the world walked. But as the years went on, it became one of many differences, the way he walked, the way he talked, his taste in clothes, his taste in music and art. All of these were sort of phenotypic expressions of something that made him very different from anyone else. And so, not surprisingly, as soon as he could, he made his brave escape to the city, part of the general exodus. In his case, he joined the Navy and then retired out and demobilized in San Francisco, the one city in the country where the way he walked, the way he talked, his taste in music, his taste in art, and ultimately his sexuality were not about to attract any attention. He had a wonderful job in a 5-star hotel. He wore a tuxedo every day. And one morning he woke up with severe left-sided chest pain. And he was admitted to San Francisco General. And one of the ironies of my life, he was actually taken care of by a good friend of mine, someone who I've known for many, many years. We found out later that we'd both cared for the same individual. And all the usual suspects were considered. Was it a heart attack? Was it pleurisy? Was it blood clot? But nothing was really evident until the third day when he blossomed out with a nice rash that looked like dewdrops on rose petals following a very clear track. And what he had was shingles, but not just shingles, but shingles complicated by inflammation of the brain, inflammation of the lining of the spinal cord. He was very sick. And during that hospital stay, they also established that he was HIV positive. He was in hospital for about 2 months. When he finally came out, he found that his job was gone. He found that he was evicted from his apartment. All his belongings, including his collection of Mapplethorpe prints, were in a box in a friend's basement. He made the call to his parents to say he was coming home. And there I was at the tail end of that call. And I was meeting him for the first time when he arrived. And I remember he was a very pleasant young man, someone that I got to know. And he was not very sick by the time he arrived. He was sort of stable. But you must remember, this is a time when we could do nothing for these young men. There was really no specific treatment for AIDS. There was only treatment for the infections that they developed. And I got to know him. He would come regularly and we would do preventive things. But he was also losing weight and gradually getting worse. And one morning I got a call saying that he had shown up in the emergency room with a very high fever. And I went to see him and we put him in the hospital. And I ran a number of tests over the next few days trying to establish the cause of this raging fever. He had 105 Fahrenheit. And I couldn't really find out what was going on, other than perhaps just the virus itself. And one morning when I went to make rounds, he stopped me and he said, Abraham, I don't want you to do any more tests. I want you to let me go home. And I couldn't argue with him because really it was unlikely we were going to change things. And so I let him go home, and he and I both knew that he was probably going to die shortly. And just before he died, 3 or 4 days before he died, he called me up and he said, Abraham, when I die, I don't want an autopsy. But if you like, you can come to my house and take biopsies of some of my organs after I die. And that way you will know what the cause of this raging fever was. And I think he knew that I'd been doing that quite a bit because I could not find pathologists at that time, 1985, 86, willing to do autopsies on AIDS patients. And yet I was often left with a burning desire to find out what had happened and learn from that. And so I promised him that I would do that I would go by his house and take post-mortem biopsies. And so on a Saturday morning, I got the call that he had died. And I remember I went over to the hospital and I picked up some small bottles of formalin and some needles and drove out to where he lived, about an hour from Johnson City, out in the countryside. And as I walked into his house, I saw neighborhood children playing outside, and I was very struck by that. And I wondered if they knew that a child just like them had a very different trajectory than the one that they were going to have. And I walked into the house, and his father, who was a preacher, said, "Praise the Lord, doctor, he's out of his misery." And his wife was just sitting there crying, saying nothing. And I walked into his bedroom and saw his body, and I was really affected by that. I mean, to this day, there's something slightly dislocating about seeing a dead body outside the hospital. But what affected me was that he looked so Christ-like. His hair had grown long and wispy, and his beard had grown long, and he was lean and emaciated and wearing a white diaper that looked just like a loincloth. So he looked like the picture of suffering. And his expression was just one of absolute suffering. But even more striking than his body, as I looked up, I suddenly realized that this was his childhood room. And I could see pictures of Christ at Gethsemane and a needlepoint verse framed in cedar. And yet, these were the icons of his childhood, but they were not his icons. His icons were in a box in a friend's basement in San Francisco, a friend who was probably dead by this time. A friend, the whole gay, close community of gay people were decimated by this virus. And as I stood there at his bedside, as I was taking these organ biopsies, I could suddenly see the voyage that this kid had made, how he'd grown up in that house, really loved by his parents, and yet feeling as if it were not his own country, as if he were an alien in that town. In fact, the title of my book, My Own Country, really stems from that sense of irony that I would feel more at home in that town than this hometown boy who looked the part, who knew all the rituals of Friday night football and possum pie and all that sort of stuff. And me, who was truly an alien, would feel more at home than he ever did because of his sexuality. And I could see how, despite all the love from his parents, he'd felt as if he were an alien. And he made his brave escape, went to the big city, and I could see how tragic it must have been to contract this virus and come back to the very room where he'd been trapped once before. And again, he was received with a great deal of love and cared for beautifully by his parents. But it must have been the most terrible failure for him to have died in this room that he once sought to escape. And when I went home that night, I wrote the first draft of a scientific paper describing this phenomenon of migration. And it became a very important scientific paper because it was suggesting that the epidemic had a different shape than we realized, and we needed to commit more resources to small towns. And indeed, I heard from many, many small town physicians saying this is exactly what we're seeing in our small town. But even as I wrote that scientific paper, I had a strong sense that the language of science didn't begin to convey the heartache and the suffering, didn't begin to convey the tragic arc of this voyage, didn't begin to convey my own grief at watching this unfold again and again. And that was the moment that I decided that I would try and write and tell the story. That was the moment that I became a writer, so to speak. I always thought that I would tell the tale through fiction, because I'd continue to read. I love reading fiction. I love as I said yesterday at the panel, I love the sort of instruction that fiction gives you. There's a lovely quote by Dorothy Allison. She says, "Fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives." Fiction has the power to change things. I'm terribly impatient with people who tell me, "Oh, I don't read fiction. I'm a serious kind of pulmonologist or proctologist, whatever you are. I read biographies and I read the latest, how to change your life in 5 minutes or the 7 laws of something, And I always get right in the face of people like that and say, "Really, you're a serious kind of person? You ever heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin?" Uncle Tom's Cabin ended slavery in America. A president didn't do that. An army didn't do that. One book captured the public's imagination, made them see the utter, abject unfairness of slavery, and began the process that ended slavery. So I always thought that I would tell my tale through fiction, and it's sort of a long story that you could probably ask me in the Q&A, how I wound up writing 2 nonfiction books before getting to fiction, which is the thing that I hope to write. And I will tell you that Cutting for Stone represented a book that I wanted to write in order to try and do, hopefully for a young reader, what Of Human Bondage had done for me. I wanted to put in it as much medical stuff as I could. I wanted every character to be either a physician or related to medicine in some fashion. I wanted every piece of drama to revolve around those relationships. I wanted to show physicians at every spectrum of both emotional and sort of scientific behavior. And it represented sort of trying to do what Of Human Bondage did for me so long ago. I want to leave you with, before we go to the Q&A, which is the part I'm really looking forward to, I want to leave you with a riddle which recurs in the book, and it's a riddle that comes up fairly frequently. It's often asked by a senior physician of a junior physician, and the riddle is as follows. It is, what treatment in an emergency is administered by ear? What treatment in an emergency is administered by ear? And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, is words of comfort. Words of comfort. Thank you very much for being so attentive. I think we have a lot of time for Q&A. So if you would, let's make it a Q&A. If you have a speech in mind, we'll put a box for you outside, and you can stand on it.
Hello, sir. So my parents wanted me to do medicine, MBBS. So I wanted to do zoology, and I'm doing it now.
You wanted to do what, sorry?
Zoology. Bachelor's degree in zoology.
Okay.
And most of my friends, okay. One guy wanted to study engineering. He scored a good cutoff in engineering, but his dad wanted him to become a doctor. So he paid donation for him to become a doctor, and he's doing MBBS now. So most of my friends, or all the youngsters, are now pursuing what they didn't want to. Somebody wanted to study game designing or whatever it is. They'll be doing BC or BCom, what their parents wanted to. And that's been the stage or the platform for most of the youngsters. What advice do you give to the parents or the youngsters to pursue our dream? And in my friends gang or whatever, I'm the only one doing what I wanted to. So.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you're doing what you want to do. Yeah, I must say, I think, you know, I have 3 sons, and my youngest, the older 2 are clearly not going into medicine. The youngest is 16, and there's a small, you know, selfish part of me that would love to see him go into medicine, only because I think I have a sense that there's so much I can hand off to him, so much in the way of folklore, and there's so much of a shared experience that I'd like to have with my son. But I've never gone so far as to suggest that he needs to do that in order to meet my approval. So it's a tricky thing. I must tell you, it doesn't change with parents who emigrate to America. I meet a lot of second-generation Indian kids who have been pressured into going to medicine, and they wake up at one moment and they're really unhappy. I heard of this situation, which I can really visualize, of a young medical student in America being called into the dean's council room, and the dean and the vice dean and the clerkship director all had to gently tell him that he was being let go from the medical school because his grades weren't making it. And it was a very, you know, sort of loaded moment, and they were all holding their breath waiting for him to say something, and he just sat there minute after minute after minute, and they finally gently said to him, you know, are you all right? Is there something you want to say? And he said, I feel for the first time in my life that this weight that's been on my chest has just been slid off. You know, and I meet people like that. I meet people who I don't think should be in medicine. I think they're in it for the wrong reasons, and they wake up typically in midlife and, you know, recognize that. And so God bless you for following your dreams. And, you know, but I think there's a part of us that tries to please our parents. A lot of our sort of motivations in life are based on parental approval, disapproval. So it's a hard thing to do. It's a thing where you often want to satisfy your parents for good reasons, and it can make you better off sometimes.
How do you manage to apportion your time between your physician job, reading, writing, because the physician job is extremely intensive, and at the same time to kind of straddle between that and your reading and writing. How would you typically allocate your time over a day, over a week? The reason I'm asking this is because I have a banking background,
A banking background?
Yeah, I lived in New York for 21 years. And now I'm a freelance writer. So I hope in the long run to write a novel. But simultaneously, I'm also getting assignments to do finance-related work for software companies in India. So I'm wondering, my God, how am I going to apportion my time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have the best answer for you. I mean, first of all, I want to tell you that I resist the notion of, being this divided being, that I'm a writer and I'm a physician and these are two separate hats, even though, I guess it's sort of facetious for me to resist that too much. But I don't see myself that way. I must tell you, I see myself as all physician. That's who I am. And to me, the writing comes out of that grand romance with medicine. That's what I write about. Even if it's a fictional novel, it remains sort of, that's the fountain from which it comes. So, if somebody offered me a villa on the beach and the opportunity to write for a year, I'd probably take it. But I think I would feel like I would no longer have the engine to write. So in other words, at least for me, being a practicing physician, being in the trenches, is terribly important in what I have to say. I'm a big fan of William Carlos Williams. Do you know William Carlos Williams, the poet? Some of you know him. His most famous poem is 3 lines. So much depends on a little red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chicken. That's it. You probably all read it in your college anthology. But anyway, William Carlos Williams was a pediatrician. And in his 70s, he wrote to a colleague saying, I'm giving up my evening clinic. He just continued to practice. But he was a poet before he became a physician. He was a contemporary of Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot. He decided to go into medicine because he felt that if you wanted to write about life, you had to be in the mainstream. You had to be swimming in the stream rather than sitting on the bank and observing. And I like that metaphor. And so I suspect that at least for me, I would not be much of a writer if I wasn't swimming the stream. And then in terms of how you do it slowly, is how I do it. So, my production of 3 books over all these years is not a lot of books. Joyce Carol Oates has already produced a novel while you and I have been speaking. That's how prolific she is. So, but I think it's also been a blessing. I've been blessed by not being in a hurry, in the sense that I love what I do. And don't get me wrong, I have great ambitions for my novels. The next novel that's coming out, I wanted to do everything. I'm not lacking in ambition for my books. But if it doesn't happen, I'll be fine. And for the same reason, I can afford to just get it right. I don't have to, take shortcuts. I don't have to rush it. So I write when I can, which is evenings, mornings, some weekends, whenever medicine and my children and other things allow it. I write a lot on planes. Hotel rooms are great places to write. So that's how I do it. I don't really have a magic solution for you. Good luck to you.
I have a question here.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about you doing the Iowa Writers Workshop and taking 2 years off to do it, and like how you can learn the skill of medicine by going to medical school. Can you learn the skill of writing by going to a writer's workshop? And I think it must have been quite a bold decision to take 2 years off after becoming a doctor to learn the craft of writing.
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about that. So I actually went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop at a very curious time in my life. I had been working in the HIV/AIDS field in that small town very intensely and getting burnt out. I felt I was on the verge of a heart attack or some sort of burnout, alcoholism, or something would happen. It was so intense. I alone was doing all the care for these 100 patients, and more than that, it was sort of the secondary thing where the metaphor of AIDS was so huge that it tainted anybody who came by. So, I was the AIDS doctor in the town. There were people who probably wanted to come see me who wouldn't come because they were afraid of who they might run into in my office. And this is a long-winded explanation, but I went to the hospital supervisor. He called me in to his office and wanted to talk to me. And I couldn't imagine what for. And this was in this private hospital where I would admit a lot of my patients. And he said, Abraham, do you think we're going to see more AIDS in the years to come? And I was thinking, what planet is this guy from? You know, I mean, every year we're seeing more patients. I said, yes, we're going to see more patients. He said, but if you weren't here, do you think we'd still see as much HIV in this town? And he had a good point. Because I was willing to see patients, they were actually coming from fairly far away to keep their anonymity. They didn't want to be seen in their town. And at that moment, I felt like my connection with the town was broken, that I could do other things. And I wanted to take a break. And I had seen many other people, my contemporaries, who had gotten burnt out and they're no longer taking care of HIV patients. And here I am 20 plus years later, I'm still taking care of AIDS. And it's because I was able to pace myself and take some time out. And I wanted to write about this story. And the Iowa Writers' Workshop, how many of you have heard of the Iowa Writers' Workshop? It's wonderful. For those of you who don't know, the University of Iowa was one of the first places to offer a master's degree or a PhD where your thesis was a collection of short stories or a novel. And the only criteria for admission was 2 short stories. Nothing else mattered. No letters, no degrees. Just you send in your 2 short stories. And over the years, it's turned out some great writers: John Irving, Kurt Vonnegut, Flannery O'Connor, Tracy Kidder. I mean, it's on and on. And so I determined that I would just apply, and if they took me, I would go. And so I applied. They took me, and I went. I cashed in my retirement plan. I gave up a tenured faculty position, took my wife and very young children on the road to Iowa. It was a very scary thing to do, but to me it actually felt better than the other option, which was to stay in that job, but be so miserable that I would, collapse in some way. But the Iowa method is very interesting because the workshop only meets once a week. And there's about 12 of you in the room with a visiting writer who's there for the semester. And your stories they discuss 2 stories. And so your story might come up once or twice in a semester. And when your story is up, everyone's had a chance to read it for 1 week. And then when it's the time for the class to meet, you sit there like a fly on the wall. You're not to say anything. And you have the wonderful opportunity of hearing people who care a lot about writing reflect on what you've just submitted. And they talk about how you've set up this fictional dream, and here's the moment when the whole thing crashed and went burning in flames because you used the wrong metaphor. The interesting thing is I never heard anyone talk about anything but the words on the page. And nobody ever talked about agents or submissions. It was all about the integrity of the words on the page and whether you were achieving this effect in the reader's mind or not. And the rest of the time was yours gloriously to develop your voice, to read, and I took great advantage of that. And it was helpful in that sense, the sense that the kind of writing that your mother thinks is cute and your wife thinks is precious doesn't fly there. In fact, as a rule of thumb, the moment your spouse finds themselves deeply disturbed by something you've written, you have found your voice. You are onto something.
Doc, you mentioned that you wrote 2 non-fiction first and then went on to write the fiction.
Yeah.
How did the non-fiction help you? Did it give you the courage to go for the fiction? Would you recommend that?
Yeah, so the non-fiction, I never set out to write non-fiction. I always thought I would be a fiction writer. And what happened is when I was in Iowa, I submitted a short story to the New Yorker magazine, which was a very dark AIDS story, and they took it. And I was delighted, and I was excited. I thought, this is my big break. And when the New Yorker editors found out a bit about my background, that I was a physician taking care of AIDS, they asked me to submit a proposal for a longer piece, maybe a 2-part series on AIDS in rural America. And I was very excited because the New Yorker paid about $1 a word, and I thought 100,000 words would be just perfect for them. So I was really, keen to do this, and I prepared this big outline. And to make a long story short, they turned it down. They turned it down for many reasons. The editor I was working with was leaving, and Tina Brown was coming on board. And I would wind up doing many more things for Tina Brown, but she didn't want that particular piece. And my agent said, what you wrote for the New Yorker, that outline, that's really a book proposal. And so we shopped it around, and there was a great deal of interest at that moment in time in the idea of a foreign heterosexual physician telling the story of AIDS in rural Tennessee. You know, it pushed a lot of different buttons, and I got a book contract, and I had to now figure out how to write a nonfiction book, and I really hadn't thought about that. And I sort of read a lot of the best nonfiction that people guided me to. George Orwell became a real model, and some of Truman Capote and so on. But I think, you know, to me there's great similarity in the sense that you need to be able to dramatize, you need to be able to use language well, you need to be able to make something come alive. But there's huge strategic differences. The great advantage, I mean, let me just ask you a poll of show of hands. How many of you think nonfiction outsells fiction? How many of you think fiction outsells nonfiction? How many of you have just tuned out? You have no idea what I'm talking about? Well, the truth is that nonfiction outsells fiction, at least in America, 20 to 1. I'm told, and David, you might correct me on this, or wherever you are, but at least in America, nonfiction outsells fiction. The reason being, if something really happened, you and I have an inherent interest in it that is not comparable to fiction. So for example, if I make up a story about an African-American kid who excels in high school football, who goes on to win the Heisman Trophy, goes on to the NFL, has a great career with a so-so team, then winds up marrying a beautiful blonde woman and moves to Hollywood, has parts in some movies, but then becomes estranged from his wife and winds up murdering her and her boyfriend in the driveway of her Brentwood home, then winds up taking off in a chase in a white Bronco down a freeway in LA, and then gets arrested and acquitted because the glove doesn't fit. As fiction, this is tawdry. No one would listen to you. It's not a story. But because it really happened, look how much time we wasted on that worthless story. And so when you have something that really happened, like this AIDS story, I think it's powerful because the reader's interested because it really happened. You still have to bring all the tools of writing to shape it and dramatize and rearrange, but you can't make up. You're also limited by that. You can't just invent. Fiction, by contrast, you can do anything. You can, go to the grave and look back, or you can, as I did in my book, have your narrator describe the events of their birth, including all the obstacles in the birth canal and so on. You can get away with it if you can get away with it, but you have to work so much harder to keep the reader's interest. So you have to make the reader forget that this is a made-up story, and by page 2 they should be in your world and have forgotten that they're behind on their bills, that life's miserable, that their knees are aching, and they are now in your world, and you cannot let them down. So it's a different contract you have, but the techniques are similar. Thank you so much for being so very attentive, and